we are used to thinking that war has a non-female face, that their lot is only bandages in hospitals or machines in factories. In this episode, we will tell you why hardened Wehrmacht soldiers felt superstitious terror at the sound of plywood biplanes and called Soviet female pilots night witches, refusing to believe that women were fighting against them. Right now, we will shake the dust off the archives and learn the truth about those who forged victory but remained in the shadow of men. When we hear the phrase World War II, images of stern men in trenches, generals hunched over maps, or pilots fighting in the air instantly pop up in our collective imagination. The stereotype that war is exclusively a male business is rooted in culture and mass consciousness so deeply that the role of women is often reduced to the function of a patient wife waiting from the front, or, at best, a selfless nurse in a snow-white coat. However, historical truth is much more complex and dramatic. If you look behind the facade of official chronicles, it turns out that women participated in this war from its very first days until the last shot. And their roles varied from heavy physical labor on factory assembly lines to performing deadly combat missions in the sky and deep in the enemy's rear. The main intrigue lies in the fact that the scale of female participation was not auxiliary, but systemic. Without millions of female hands, the economies of warring countries would have collapsed in the first months. And without female signalers, cryptographers, and anti-aircraft gunners, the air defense of major cities would have been paralyzed. Moreover, as the conflict dragged on, turning into a total war of attrition, gender barriers began to crumble under the pressure of necessity. Women did not just replace men, they created precedents that the history of wars had not yet known. The brightest example breaking the weaker sex template was the Soviet female pilots of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The Germans, encountering their night raids for the first time, were so shocked that they nicknamed them Nachthexen, night witches. The fear these women inspired on their plywood biplanes was not just military, but almost superstitious. It was a pattern break. The enemy taught to be despised and considered weak turned out to be a ruthless and elusive night hunter. The story of the witches is just the tip of the iceberg. Behind it lie the fates of thousands of scouts, snipers, partisans, and underground fighters, whose names often remained classified for decades. We will travel from the pre-war years, when women were just starting to be trained for service, through the darkest days of occupation, when ordinary housewives became resistance liaisons, to the triumph and tragedy of 1945. We will see how the war-forced societies, which had recently lived by conservative laws, to admit, when the survival of a nation is at stake, heroism and self-sacrifice have no gender. The women of World War II are not just helpers of heroes. They were heroes themselves, often unknown, whose story it is time to tell in full. The period preceding the start of World War II is often called the time of the gathering storm, and it was during these years that the quiet mobilization of female resources began in various countries. Although officially the world was still living a peaceful life, military and state strategists understood. The coming conflict would require the participation of all citizens, regardless of gender. However, the approach to this issue differed significantly in different states, reflecting the cultural and political peculiarities of that time. In Great Britain, specialized women's services under the armed forces began to form and reorganize by the late 1930s. The authorities, remembering the experience of World War I, created structures in advance that would allow men to be released for the front line. Thus appeared the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, under the Army, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAF, and the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRNS. It is important to note that the role of these organizations was initially defined as non-combat, but in fact, they trained specialists for critical areas. British women were purposefully trained to work with complex communications equipment, the basics of air defense, AD, logistics, and airfield maintenance. It was not just charity or a patriotic circle, but systematic training of professional personnel who were to become the nervous system of the army. In other countries, the situation developed differently, but with a similar vector. In Nazi Germany, where official ideology assigned women the role of keeper of the hearth, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, reality dictated its conditions. Despite Hitler's rhetoric that war is not a woman's business, German women were already actively involved in industry and the healthcare system through various public organizations in the 30s. Formally, they were not allowed into military service, but in fact, a huge reserve of labor force ready to stand at the machines was created. In the Soviet Union, where equality was officially declared, women already worked en masse in factories and collective farms, and also actively participated in the activities of Osoaviakim, learning shooting, parachuting, and first aid. By 1939, a paradoxical situation had developed in the world, reminiscent of a compressed spring. On the one hand, there was a huge accumulated potential of female skills and readiness to serve. Women knew how to drive trucks, repair engines, handle radio stations, and even shoot. On the other hand, official military doctrines and public opinion still resisted the idea of a female soldier. The authorities of many countries did not recognize this resource for a long time, fearing the destruction of traditional foundations. This effect of delayed recognition led to the fact that when the war did begin, states had to urgently legalize and expand female participation, often changing laws and regulations on the go. The quiet preparation of the 30s became the foundation on which an army of unsung heroines grew during the war years, whose skills proved life-saving for their countries at the most critical moment. With the outbreak of active hostilities in Europe in September 1939, the role of women instantly transformed from auxiliary to fundamental. The war, which had become total, required the mobilization of the entire economy, and it was women who became the core that kept the rear from collapse. Millions of men went to the front, leaving empty jobs in factories, the transport system, and agriculture. Women, yesterday's housewives, students, and employees, took their places en masse. It was not a matter of choice. It was a condition for the nation's survival. They stood at machines producing shells and tanks, sat behind the wheel of trucks and buses, took over the management of farms, providing the army with food. This transformation was especially evident in Great Britain, which was the first to face the threat of a German invasion and the aerial blitz. Here, women began to be actively involved not only in production, but also in the direct defense of the islands. They became radar operators tracking the approach of the Luftwaffe, worked at searchlight stations, illuminating targets for anti-aircraft guns, and served in barrage balloon crews. Although they were formally forbidden to pull the trigger of anti-aircraft guns, they did all the work of targeting and ensuring firing, effectively becoming part of combat crews. Women in air defense and civil defense services became the eyes and ears of Britain. Their calm voice on the air and precise coordinates saved cities from total destruction. At the same time, on the continent, where Nazi Germany rapidly occupied one country after another movement hidden from the eyes was born. The first resistance participants appeared in the occupied territories of France, Poland, the Netherlands, and other countries. These were the invisible heroines of the initial stage of the war. They did not wear uniforms and did not go into attacks, but their work was deadly dangerous. Women became ideal couriers and liaisons, taking advantage of the fact that the occupiers suspected them less. Under the guise of ordinary shopping or walks with children, they carried secret reports, maps, money for the underground, and even weapons. Many of these first scouts and liaisons left no loud names in history. They acted in conditions of complete conspiracy, risking not only their lives, but also the lives of their families. It was on their fragile shoulders that the first, still weak and scattered underground networks rested. They hid downed Allied pilots, organized the escape of prisoners of war, and distributed underground press, maintaining the spirit of resistance in a seemingly hopeless situation. Their feat was quiet, devoid of pathos, but it was these daily routine acts of courage that created the ground for the future powerful resistance movement. The period of 1939-1941 became a time when women proved they are capable not only of replacing men in the rear, but also of waging their own, hidden but effective war against the invaders. The attack of Nazi Germany on the Soviet Union in June 1941 became a turning point that radically changed the scale and nature of female participation in the war. If earlier women mainly acted in the rear or auxiliary services, the cruelty and existential threat of the Eastern Front forced the removal of the last taboos. Women took up arms en masse, standing in the same ranks as men. In the USSR, this process was initiated from below. Military enlistment offices were overwhelmed with thousands of applications from female volunteers demanding to be sent to the front line. The symbol of this new stage was the legendary pilot Marina Raskova. Using her authority and persistence, she obtained permission to form women's aviation units. Thus, in October 1941, 3 women's aviation regiments were created, the most famous of which was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. This was a unique unit where all positions, from pilots and navigators to mechanics and technicians, were held by women. They flew on light plywood PO2, U-2 biplanes, created for training, not for war. These planes had no armor, no serious protection, not even parachutes at first, but the girls turned their shortcomings into a formidable weapon. The regiment's tactics were daring and exhausting for the enemy. The pilots flew out at night, making 10-15 sorties per night. Approaching the target, they turned off the engines so that the plane glided silently and dropped bombs on German headquarters, warehouses, crossings, and echelons. The only sound warning of death was the whistling of the wind in the wing braces, resembling the sound of a broom. It was for this tactic and elusiveness that German soldiers nicknamed them Nachthexen, night witches. This fear was not just military. It had a mystical tinge. The enemy could not believe that such damage was inflicted by women on whatnots. There is much tragic, heroic, and even anecdotal in this section of war history. There are known cases where the German command, annoyed by the impunity of the witches, promised their anti-aircraft gunners and pilots the Iron Cross just for shooting down at least one such plane. The memoirs of the pilots themselves are full of stories about how captured German officers, learning who bombed them, refused to believe it, considering it propaganda or a joke. But reality was harsh. The 588th Regiment went a combat path from the Caucasus to Germany, making tens of thousands of sorties and dropping tons of bombs. Besides pilots, in this period women en masse became snipers, signalers, tankers, and machine gunners. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who became the most successful female sniper in history, killed 309 fascists, becoming a living legend in her lifetime. The period of 1941-1943 finally destroyed the myth that a woman cannot be a soldier. They proved that in conditions of total war, gender differences are erased in the face of common danger and a single goal: victory. By the middle of the war, occupied Europe had turned into a battlefield of a secret war, where women played key, often leading roles. If on the Eastern Front, women fought openly, in the West, their weapons became conspiracy, intelligence, and the ability to remain unnoticed. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, and the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, began actively recruiting and deploying female agents to France and other occupied countries. The logic was pragmatic. A woman aroused less suspicion among German patrols. It was easier for her to move around the city, transport goods, or collect information. The names of such agents as Nancy Wake and Virginia Hall became legendary during the war. Nancy Wake, nicknamed the White Mouse by the Gestapo for her elusiveness, became one of the most wanted persons. She did not just transmit information, but coordinated the actions of large French resistance units, maquis, participated in battles, and organized sabotage on railways. Virginia Hall, an American with a prosthetic leg, whom the Germans called the Limping Lady, created one of the most successful intelligence networks in France, organizing the escape of prisoners of war and arms supplies to partisans. These women lived under the constant sword of Damocles of arrest, torture, and execution, but continued their work. In France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Poland, women formed the backbone of the resistance infrastructure. They acted as the connecting arteries of the underground, carrying orders, hiding radio operators, forging documents. The enemy's gender stereotypes became their weapon. A German soldier seeing a pretty girl on a bicycle in front of him often could not suspect that explosives or encrypted messages lay in the basket under the groceries. Women were also actively involved in recruitment, using their social connections to involve new people in the struggle. Special attention deserves little-known pages of history related to groups of foreign women and Jewish women. In Germany and the occupied territories, groups engaged in psychological warfare and disinformation operated. Jewish liaison girls in Poland penetrated into the ghetto and back, bringing news and weapons, becoming a link between doomed prisoners and the outside world. Their stories remained in the shadows for a long time, even within national narratives about the war, although their contribution was colossal. They did not just help the resistance, they were an integral part of it. That invisible army, without which open uprisings and sabotage would have been impossible. This period showed that female courage can be quiet, but no less destructive to the enemy. The final stage of World War II became a time of the highest strain of forces, and women were involved in the decisive events of this period with unprecedented intensity. From the preparation of the Normandy landings to the storming of Berlin, their presence was felt everywhere. Operation Overlord, the Allied landing in France in June 1944, would have been impossible without the painstaking work of thousands of women. Employees of the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRNS, and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, in Great Britain, worked around the clock, deciphering German codes, analyzing aerial photographs, weather reports, and coordinating giant convoys. Their work in headquarters and communication centers ensured the accuracy and secrecy that became the key to the success of the invasion. On the Eastern Front, as the Red Army advanced west, the role of women in combat units remained high. They continued to serve as snipers, anti-aircraft gunners, covering crossings and cities from the last desperate raids of the Luftwaffe, and, of course, signalers ensuring troop control in the chaos of the offensive. But female heroism was especially evident in the urban uprisings of 1944, primarily in the Warsaw Uprising. Here, Polish women went to the barricades en masse. They were not only traditional nurses, dragging the wounded out of fire, but also full-fledged fighters, saboteurs, liaisons, making their way through sewers, canals, and even commanders of small combat groups. The Warsaw Uprising finally broke the stereotype of women near the front, showing her as an active subject of street fighting. One cannot forget the colossal role of women in medical support and logistics at the final stage of the war. Statistics speak for themselves. In the Soviet Army, women accounted for 41% of doctors and 43% of surgeons. The majority of nursing and junior medical staff were also women. It was their hands that returned millions of wounded soldiers to service, providing armies with the necessary resource for the last push. In the rear and in the liberated territories, women restored railways, bridges, and infrastructure, ensuring uninterrupted supply to the advancing troops. In 1945, when the war came to the territory of Germany, female military personnel of the Allied armies, Soviet, American, British, became witnesses and participants in the finale of the tragedy. They entered liberated concentration camps, providing first aid to survivors, documenting Nazi crimes, and participating in establishing peaceful life. The period of 1944-1945 became the culmination of female participation. They were everywhere, in the sky, at sea, in headquarters, in hospitals, and on the front line with a machine gun in their hands. Without their contribution, often remaining behind the scenes of official chronicles, the victory over fascism would have been impossible, or would have cost even more blood. As soon as the victory salutes died down, a process began that historians call the Great Oblivion. Societies tired of war and upheaval strove to return to normal life as soon as possible, and there was no place for a female soldier in this picture of the world. In many countries, including the USSR, the USA, and Great Britain, women began to be quickly and persistently returned to pre-war social roles. Mothers, wives, housewives. State policy and public pressure worked synchronously. There were not enough jobs for men returning from the front, and women were gently but resolutely pushed out of factories and the army. The military experience of millions of women turned out to be displaced into the sphere of private memory. If male veterans created unions, wrote memoirs, and received public recognition, women often remained silent. Their feats were discussed in a narrow family circle, but rarely made it to the pages of school textbooks or onto big screens. Post-war culture and propaganda preferred safe and traditional images. An abstract merciful nurse, or in the West, Rosie the Riveter, a symbol of the labor rear, not combat brotherhood. The real stories of snipers, night bomber pilots, saboteurs, and scouts seemed too inconvenient, too unladylike for peacetime. There was also a darker reason for this silence: the unwillingness to touch upon the topic of gender violence and trauma faced by women in war, as well as society's fear of admitting that a woman can be not only a victim, but also an active subject of armed violence, a skilled and ruthless fighter. The glorification of war was built on a male narrative, where a woman was assigned the role of the one being protected, not the one protecting herself. The slow return of names and stories began only decades later. First, separate memoirs and works of fiction appeared, like Svetlana Alexievich's book, War Does Not Have a Woman's Face, which broke the dam of silence. Later, with the development of feminist studies and new social history, researchers began to purposefully search for documents and testimonies about night witches, SOE agents, women of the French Resistance. Documentary projects and films of recent years have finally begun to return these unsung heroines to the public field. Today, we understand that the women of World War II are not an exception to the rule and not a beautiful episode. This is a whole hidden layer of world history, without which the picture of the war remains incomplete and distorted. Recognizing their contribution is not just a tribute of respect. It is the restoration of historical truth that victory was forged by joint efforts, and half of this burden lay on female shoulders. The history of World War II is not only generals and offensive maps. It is millions of personal destinies, and half of them are female. Today, we were convinced heroism has no gender, and courage does not depend on the charter. And whose story struck you the most? The fearless Soviet night witches or the elusive British intelligence agents in Europe? Write your opinion in the comments. It is very important for us to know what you think. If this episode opened something new for you, support us with a like and subscription to the channel. There are still many unknown pages of history ahead. See you.